Right. So, yes, optional lecture on handling photo uploads. So there are a few ways you can handle photos. So if, for example, you want users to be able to upload like a profile picture or something like that. Uh, so you can actually store those files on the server. So if you have an Nginx server, which is um, handling your application, you can actually store those files there, and that works. But it's not really a best practice, meaning it's not a great idea and it doesn't scale very well. So the standard thing, the so-called best practice, is to um, have have a third party handle actually storing the images, and that's usually some kind of service. So AWS has an S3 bucket, which is just like storage. It acts like a file. It's not really a file system, but it looks like a file system. You can interact with it as though it were a file system. And then other providers have similar things. It's like Azure has blob store. They call it blob storage. So just a way to store some file of some kind. So in order to do that, you're going to have to have, so I'm going to use AWS for this example. You're going to have an S3 bucket. So with the free tier, I'm not clear on exactly all of the rules, but you do get some S3 storage for free. There are limits, so buyer beware, but it should be fine if you're just using it like as a demo. All right. So I'm gonna go here and check out this code real quick. So this is I have a working example based on what we saw last week. So I'm gonna open this up. And I'm gonna check out the images branch. All right, I'll just take a quick look at this. This is the standard wine API. There's really nothing terribly interesting happening. There's just a couple small additions to the back end and to the front end. And I'll just walk through those real quick. Before we do that, we'll set up all of the S3 infrastructure, which in this case is just a bucket. I would say in general, the hard part, or the hard, obnoxious part about S3 is setting up all the permissions and everything. Because as you see with the EC2 instances, you can create one, but if you don't expose the right port and give it the right permissions, it just doesn't work, and it doesn't tell you why it's not working. So you had similar issues with that. All right, so I'm going to go here to my account, and I'm going to create an S3 bucket. So we can go here, S3. Create a bucket. And so your bucket name, as it says, has to be unique. You can call it whatever you want. I think in the example, I called it be able to use that still. But yeah, you can call us whatever you want as long as it's an available name. And the region, I think you just leave it to whatever the default is. That's fine. It doesn't matter for our purposes. And then right here, we're going to disable this. This is block all public access. So by default, AWS wants you to be very, it follows the principle of least privilege. which is good security practice. We're gonna, violate that a little bit. It'll be fine. But sometimes you want buckets to be just private, so you can use it internally with another service. But in this case, we want it to be public because we want users to be able to go to the URL to fetch the image so that they can display on the front end. We need to make this public, and yes, you sign your life away, and then everything else should be just default. That'll be fine. So I've created the bucket, and the bucket is basically a URL you can go to store stuff. So here's my bucket. It doesn't have anything in it. And you can see properties, for example. This is like the official AWS name for this resource, this thing. ARN colon a blah blah blah. So this is the official AWS name. We'll use that in a second. And there's a bunch of other stuff we don't need to worry about right now. And then for permissions, we're going to need to make some changes here. Okay. So we'll go here, and then I'm going to go to bucket policy and edit this. And then I'm going to use the policy generator. So we're going to need to paste some JSON in here, which will describe the policy. So AWS has a standard way of doing this. So if you have something available, you can paste it in there. Otherwise, we're gonna create it here. So the type of policy, this is going to be for an S3 bucket. And the effect will be to allow. So we want to allow certain kinds of access. And the principal, you can just use an asterisk here. And then the AWS service, so this is for S3, this is pre-selected here. And then the action, we want get object. We find get object. So this will allow, someone to go here and, access to get object is just like making a get request, basically. And then the resource ARN, we're going to go back here. I'll put this in another tab. And go to the properties, and then we can grab that right here. So that's the ARN. You can put that in there, and then you can also add a slash star. And so this ARN is just for the bucket itself, but we want people to be able to access not just the bucket, but anything that's in the bucket, basically. So we add the slash asterisk there. And let's see. All right, so let's look at the result. It's right here. So this is the JSON. We want to allow someone to get objects in the S3 bucket. And which bucket is it? It's this bucket right here. So I'm going to copy this. You don't need to worry about specifics here. And we're going to paste that in. And then save changes. So that should be good there. The next thing I'm gonna have to do is I'm gonna have to create credentials for my account. So this is similar to what we had to do for Terraform. If you recall that lecture. So if we want to use Terraform, we have to go into our AWS account and get access keys, which will basically give permission to the CLI tool to act on our behalf. So instead of username and password, you just get a a key. So I'll do that right now, and I'm going to delete this right after. If I don't, please remind me at the end of the lecture. So I'm going to go to AWS. I'm going to go to IAM. You can also go just directly here to security credentials under your account, or you can also go to IAM and get to it through there. Okay, so I'm going to go create an access key. And yes. And you can copy these or whatever. I'm going to download as a CSV file. It makes it a little easier to keep track of later. So there we go. So I have the key. Here's the access key and then the secret, basically. So you need both of these. All right. So we'll use that in a minute. Okay. So in order to actually do all this stuff, we have to make sure that we install Django storages. So there are a number of ways you can do this. You don't have to use this particular library or anything. It's just probably the simplest way of doing it. But you can do it without using this library. So I'm gonna actually double check. I don't know if I updated the requirements here. Did I did. Okay. So what's on this branch is a working version. So it already has this installed, but you'll need to install these libraries, and then you can add those to your requirements.txt. And then in the settings.py, there's just a few things you need to add. So we'll take a look at that. Where is the settings? So here, default file storage. So this is like a class in that third-party library that we're gonna refer to. So Django storage is the library, backends S3 storage. And then here we're going to grab these credentials from an environment variable, and the key, the ID and the key, that's this right here. So we're gonna pull it. We're not gonna hard code these because we're checking this in to GitHub, etc. So we don't want those credentials actually exposed, because that people could spend lots of money on your account. You don't want that. So you have to provide both of these, and then this is also the name of the bucket. So this will be whatever you happen to call your bucket. So whatever that is. And then I would set this to false. If you don't set it to false, the credential will be part of the URL, basically. It's like a query. It adds the credentials to the query string. So I wouldn't do that, especially if you're allowing, normal people on the internet to access this stuff. So I would set this to false. And that's pretty much it there. And then, so how do we get these credentials? Well, you can look here in the Docker compose, just add these right here. So when you run the dev compose, you just need to supply 2 extra environment variables, and the same thing with prod. You have 2 extra environment variables. And if you look at the dev script, so the script that basically, the job of the script is basically to supply the environment variables that the Docker compose file needs. So you have these dummy values which don't matter, like for local development. Like these can be anything, but these are real credentials. So there are ways. So I'm not. There are ways where you could mock S3 locally. I'm not gonna to go through that, but in an ideal world, you would mock S3 locally. So as you're doing local development, you're not actually hitting your actual S3 bucket. But yeah. it's an additional complication. Maybe it's not worth it at this point. Okay, so we have the credentials there. Those are going to get exported as environment variables. Your Docker Compose will pick those up, and it will inject those into the container when it's run. So that's how your application will actually get access to these. And this is similar to what we were talking about earlier, where you don't want your front end to have API credentials. So any additional API credentials that you would want your backend to have, you do something like this. You pass them in as an environment variable, and then so only your backend has those. All right. So that's the basic setup. This is just what this library. So if you look at the documentation here, kind of walks through, and then you can also look at other examples online. Okay. So we have the bucket now, and we have our app has permissions and ability to interact with S3 now. But our application still isn't doing anything with any of those images. So in order to actually do that, we're gonna have to modify both the back end to handle images and the front end to upload images. So we're gonna go here to the model that's gonna have the image. And right here, so I've added this column, which is called picture, and notice that it's a file field. So there are image fields, but if you use an image field, it's gonna actually store the real image, the image itself, which basically you don't want. So what's actually going to be stored here is a URL. It's just going to be a reference to where it's stored in the S3 bucket. So our database isn't going to have the actual image in it. It's just going to have a reference or a link to that image. And this upload to, this can be whatever you want, doesn't matter. It's just going to be a path or like a folder in your S3 bucket. So we have this S3 bucket, and then you can create lots of folders and then etc. So just like a file system. So everything that gets stored is going to be under WinePix, which can be whatever you want it to be. And then I'm just saying, this can be nullable. It doesn't matter. You don't have to. You could make this a required field. Okay. So that's pretty much it from the backend perspective. You just have to add this file field, and then the serializers. You don't have to do anything special. You just have to make sure that it's also a file field here, but nothing really tricky there. Okay, and then on the front end, let's see, yeah, same stuff, blah blah blah. On the front end, it's slightly more complicated, but I'll show you that. I think it's this one, CSS. Yeah. So now, before this was not there. So what we basically had to do is we can't just use the default application JSON. We're not just sending application JSON now. We're sending form data. So this right here, I'll look this up real quick. So this is a web API. So like lots of things like this, like storage, for example, other things. This is a web API, meaning that it's not really part of JavaScript. It's just stuff that you can use when you're in the browser. And this is one of those things. So the form data interface provides a way to construct a set of key value pairs representing form fields and their values, blah, blah, blah. And instead of being application JSON, the type that you're sending, it's multi-part form data. And you can look at this, but the basic way you use this is you create an instance of this form data class, and then you append stuff to it. So this is the name, the price, blah, blah, blah. And then the new thing is this. And if you look at the append signature, it takes a name and then a blob value. And then the third optional parameter, see where it says file name question mark, that means it's an optional parameter, and that is a string. So it says string bar undefined, so that's actually a type. So this is kind of like, if you get into TypeScript or anything like that, you'll see stuff like this. Basically, it means it can be either a string or it can be undefined, meaning that it doesn't exist. So yeah. So you just have to deal with this slight difference, this form data API, and then when you post it, the form data API actually will take care of telling you what type it is. So you don't specify application JSON or multi-part form data. It will actually take care of that for you. So all you have to do is say it's a post request, and then you give it the body. It's actually simpler from that perspective. And then over here, so this wine image. So all this stuff is all of this stuff. We'll see it in a sec, but this is all just like text input fields. But here we have a file type input. Okay, so those are the front end changes that need to happen. So I'm going to go ahead and spin this up now. Let's see. All right, so I'm going to look at my script. So I'm going to run this in dev first, and then I'll deploy it. So run compose dev. And I'm going to pass it. The first parameter will be the key ID, which is right here. And the second parameter will be this thing. Any questions while that spins up? I'm curious, has anyone already done something like this?
It's definitely something I'd like to do, but probably won't have time in the 3 weeks. So I'll just have to go back and do it.
Okay, cool.
So I'm working with uploading a audio file, but I send it to the API and it converts it into its own length. So this is something I could use if I wanted to save that file and list them in the future for the user.
Okay, cool. All right, so Docker PS. Okay, everything's running, looks good. So I'm gonna go to localhost. All right, I'm gonna open the dev tool just to make sure there are any problems. So I got the network tab open. So there are no wines. I'm gonna create one. And then here I have this image upload. I can choose file. I'm gonna go to my desktop. Okay, so it looks like everything went out okay. So I can look at this. so this is from my API. This is the response that I'm getting. So the request itself, let me see. The request itself went to my API, not directly to S3. So I send it to the API, and the API handles interacting with S3. If I list wines, I should see that now. And that image actually should come from the S3 bucket. So when I save it, I send the image to my API. The API takes that image, saves it to S3 for me, and then this link, this URL gets saved to the database. And then when I list the wines, we'll go look at the code real quick. When I list the wines, I'm grabbing this URL that has been saved in the database. And then that gets injected into this image tag. And then when the image is loaded, it's going to make a request directly to the S3 bucket to get the image. So that's basically the application database only has this URL in it. S3 is storing the actual content itself. So that is pretty much it. There's another thing which I actually didn't know about, and I discovered when I was doing this. I tried to upload a very large image by default. So I'll deploy this as well in a second. But yeah, I tried to upload a very large image and realized that by default, Nginx has a limit, the size of the request's body. It's not specific to images. It's just, you're putting this thing in the body of an HTTP request. So you can actually configure that. So I did that here. You probably won't need to do that. Maybe even shouldn't do that, but you can, and I did that here. So so usually we have this Docker file, and then we have this default conf, which is going to basically describe where requests are routed. But I had to add this other thing, and this nginx.conf file comes by default. So what I did is I copied it, so all the default stuff, and then I added this line right here, which is client max body size, and I set it to some arbitrary value. And then in the Docker file, I just have to make sure that I also copy that over. So not just the usual default conf, but I also have to copy over this configuration file to here. So you probably won't have to do that, but yeah, just to let you know. All right. So so now I'm going to try and make sure. So this runs locally. So I am fairly confident that it should work. So now I'm going to deploy this. So in order to deploy it, I go ahead and spin this down. I have the Docker Compose stop. I do. Okay, so I'm going to spin that down, and then I need to push up the images. I think all this stuff should be good. Yeah, some of you, depending on maybe the version of the Mac OS or the version of Docker you're using, there's some issues with this. So I know people have made some slight tweaks to these, so feel free to do that. So I'm going to run this /build and push images. And the base URL I don't have yet, so I gotta go make the S3 bucket, or sorry, the EC2 instance. Okay. All the defaults. My IP, HTTP traffic should be good. And then I'll launch it. And once I get the IP address, should have here, I can use that to push up the images. So I'll pass that in. That's the base URL, the first argument. And the second argument is the version name. I'm just going to say I'm on version 6.4. So this will be whatever the version happens to be. Okay. All right, and while that's happening, I'll see if this is finished spinning up yet. And I'm gonna connect to it and I'm gonna install Docker and all that stuff. So I'm gonna be very lazy, sorry, and do this. I'll open up. And okay, so I'm in, so I'm gonna exit. And I'm gonna now copy over I need to copy over the Docker compose prod and then the run compose prod script and also the setup EC2. So to do that, I'm gonna paste this and modify it. So use SCP, so secure copy. You also have to pass it the credential, and then so I'm gonna go the files you want. So it's always from to. That's kind of a Linux standard. So from my local thing to wherever I want it. And the files that I want are setup EC2, run compose prod, and then Docker compose prod. And then I push it up here, and then I also need to give it a file path, which I believe is going to be home slash PC. We'll see if that throws an error. Okay, so I'm gonna SSH into there again, and I can make sure that that worked. Okay, so I have all the files there. So now I'm going to run the setup script, install Docker and Docker compose. Okay, and once I do that, then I should be able to run the prod script. So / run compose prod, and I need to pass that script some stuff. So I'll take a look at that to remind myself, what do I need? A secret key. So, I'm just going to give it arbitrary values, but this could be an actual secret that you have. Debug false, Postgres DB, my DB, my user, my password, new version. What did I use? Like 6 point something.
I think you did 6.4.
Thank you. 6.4. And then what else? The access key. I'm going to grab that. And the secret. Okay. So should be able, it should just run. We'll see. Meanwhile, I'll also check out the bucket just to make sure that it's actually saving. I mean, I think it is, but we can verify that. So we'll go to S3. Okay, and here's this line fix. So this is what the arbitrary value we gave here. This upload to. So this is that folder that's going to get, everything's going to get put in. So it created the folder. And then here we have the image stored. And you can actually select the image and you can see copy S3 URI. So here's that. This is like the S3 URL, and then here's the actual.
Does it have to be a JPEG?
No, actually, it can be anything. I tested it with a PDF. The PDF obviously doesn't display, but you can upload anything. As far as I know, I mean, to S3 doesn't care. There may be something that's happening in the Django storages that checks, but I don't think so.
So for an S3 bucket, you could probably use it for multiple different projects if you wanted to. You just make different files.
Yeah, definitely. It's pretty easy. Like, creating an S3 bucket is, cheap and easy. So you can either use, it depends on what your use case is. You can create separate buckets, or you can just create different files, or different folders. Yeah, you can basically store infinite stuff in an S3 bucket.
There's no like limit on gigabytes or anything like that.
No, I mean if you're using the free tier, there are limits, but if you're just in an absolute sense, no, I think you can store as much stuff. I mean, like at work, we use S3 buckets and we have terabytes of data.
What so it's basically just like file storage. So it's not just like specific for images, but you could keep all kinds of stuff on this bucket essentially.
Yeah, you could take every file on your computer and put it in an S3 bucket if you want.
Nice.
All right, and so here is the URL. This is in the application. HTTPS Henry is hanging out. Blah 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 blah. And if you look here at the URL, here's that URL. So you can actually go there, and there's the image. So that's all working. So now I want to see. It looks like this is running now. So I want to make sure that the application is working in production. So I'll go to the running instances and grab that IP address. Okay, so let me open the DevTools. Okay, so list lines, there's nothing because we haven't saved anything here. So create one. And then I save a file. Submit. Okay, no errors, so that's a good sign. I can check the request. It went to not localhost anymore, but whatever this wherever the EC2 instance is running. And then I can list them and it shows up. And I can look right here. Where did this image come from? It came from the S3 bucket. So yeah, this is one way. I think there's probably maybe a simpler way. I think probably roughly the simplest way you could go about handling the stuff properly. The only thing about this setup that isn't like totally in line with best practices is the fact that we're using our production S3 bucket in development. So in general, you want to keep, you have like a local environment, you have a development environment, and you have a production environment. These are all kind of totally separate things, but we're cheating a little bit, which is fine, but just so you're aware of that. There are ways to mock S3. There's a couple things, something called min.io. I wouldn't necessarily worry about it, but like for your personal projects, but this is more just FYI. So there's something like this you can actually run another container locally, which will act like S3. So you can run everything locally and kind of have like a fake S3 locally, and then when you put it in production, it's going to actually use the real S3 bucket. But that's all. That's all I got for right now. I'm going to delete this access key now. I'll spin everything down. Any questions? I'll delete this and then stop the video.